we took a longer than 3 minute break. But I'm really glad that people have had time to settle down. So now we're back with our keynote for today, Mitchell Green, and he's going to talk to us today about LLMs and language understanding, a talk which I'm really excited about. So Mitch, please have the word.
A lot of fun. And as we're blessed with some lovely weather here in Bucharest, so that's nice too. By way of sort of ground rules for my talk, my general policy is if you feel, because I don't have the privileged ability to speak Romanian, if you feel that my English is uninterpretable or difficult for you to understand, or because sometimes the end of my sentences sometimes trail off, just raise your hand and say, could you please repeat that? Or if I accidentally use some jargon that you don't understand, please just say, hey, Mitch, what does that mean? Be happy to explain it. If you disagree, that's cool too, but that means you take yourself to understand what I'm saying and you're disagreeing with it, and that'll be for Q&A. But if you just don't feel like you're getting what I'm saying, just don't hesitate to shoot up an arm. Is that cool? We got an agreement? Great. All right, so this talk will partly be about LLMs, but you'll see I'm going to sort of expand the topic a little bit to machines with a bit more sophistication for certain purposes. So I'm going to consider the case for the claim that what I'll call LLM understanding, that state-of-the-art LLMs, particularly if embodied or embedded rather in a humanoid robot, may understand some of the language that they receive and or produce. This case depends on separating understanding from an experience of understanding. It's going to be important. On a consideration of how LLMs operate, and on looking at a reasonable account of what language understanding consists in. In light of these considerations, I'm going to suggest that LLM understanding is true. I'm going to quote from a recent article by Millet and Cameron Buckner, who write in the philosophical introduction to language models. They write, there has, in our opinion, never been a more important time for philosophers from a variety of backgrounds, but especially philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, epistemology, philosophy of science, to engage with foundational questions about artificial intelligence. I'm going to take that as my sort of vade mecum. And we know that LLMs are quite good at a wide range of language involving tasks, such as they write better essays than the average undergraduate student, at least American graduate student. I might not be saying quite as much. Program better than the average software engineer, rank in the 80th to 99th percentile on graduate admissions tests, and solve many difficult mathematical problems. And I've just learned can sometimes put their answers in the form of a Shakespearean sonnet. And yet, many have doubted that chatbots count as understanding language. Bender, in a famous, or maybe I should say notorious article, write that there's a tendency of human interlocutors to impute meaning where there is none, and that this can mislead the general public into taking synthetic texts as meaningful. According to them, LLMs are merely babbling stochastic parrots. And if you see a published version of their article, it actually contains an image of a little green parrot in the title. Babbling stochastic parrots that produce the image of human language, but in fact fall short in meaningful communication. Or Mallory writes that LLMs don't actually produce meaningful texts, and that to treat them as such is to engage in kind of useful fiction. Lake and Murphy, there's a principled limit to an LLM's ability to build knowledge structures that form part of the basis of word meanings. Goldman says they're not capable of performing speech acts, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of skepticism. But to try to allay some of that skepticism, I first want to talk about do some philosophy of mind. And the way I see it, there are four distinct kinds of mentality. First, there's what I want to call cognitive states. Those include beliefs, memories, expectations, knowledge, understanding, subjective probability, degrees of belief, what some people call cognitive states. Those are intentions, goals, objectives, desires, plans, preference rankings. And as anybody who's done philosophy of action and philosophy of mind knows, those two things tend to go hand in hand. You want an agent to act rationally, you're probably going to need some cognitive as well as some cognitive states. Otherwise, to take Hume's famous example, if all I have is cognitive states, and you tell me the building I'm in is burning, not much I'm going to do just yet. I got to care about my life for someone else's at least. Affective states, emotions and moods. I see emotions as object requiring. So to have hope, there has to be an answer to the question, what am I hopeful for? But I might be anxious, that's a mood, because I just drank too much espresso. There's no answer to the question, what am I anxious about? Two types of affective state. Experiential, those are what people call qualia, phenomenal consciousness, sentience, etc. These are words that tend to hypnotize the mind. Be careful. Could there be a type 5 state and other kinds of intelligent creatures or artifacts? There may well be. I'm open to that possibility. I don't want to be a prioristic about this kind of thing. And higher order states can be built from from these four. For example, when we say things like I'm excited about what I just learned, or I want to stop being sad. Those are meta states in which you've got an affective state directed towards a cognitive, et cetera, et cetera. And wisdom and sapience involve combination of one and two type states. Acting wisely. There's no overlap. Many of our one or two or three type states have experiential dimensions. There's generally a way that sadness feels. Is there a way that hope feels? Nah, I'm not so sure. Sometimes, not necessarily. But Pache, some types of cognitive phenomenology, and whenever I say this phrase cognitive phenomenology, feel free to hiss or to boo or something. Whenever I say that phrase, Pache cognitive phenomenology, one type states, that is cognitive states, do not require any phenomenology. Many of them are associated with it, but they're not constitutive. More on this later. And as there's no requirement that one to four type states have to be instantiated together. It's really important. That is to say, there's no reason a priori or in terms of metaphysical possibility that I can see that says that to have any kind of mentality of a types one and two, you have to have types three and four. We're just contingent and jury-rigged results of evolution through natural selection. There's no reason why we have to have the four types of mentality that we do. One and two go together, as I've said. Others, maybe, maybe not. So when somebody asks, can machines think? You should stare back at them without blinking and say, what do you mean? That's an ambiguous question. It's kind of like saying, what's the meaning of life? Well, why are you presupposing that life has meaning? And if it does, well, why do you say the? Maybe there are 11 things that give life meaning. I don't know. So too, when you say can machine think, you're asking if they can do all four of the aforementioned things, three, two, which ones? And if it's a subset. So my version of the question for today concerns machine cognition, and really only that. That is, can machines engage in cognitive states, have cognitive states? Thus, my topic's narrow AI instead of the dreaded AGI, artificial general intelligence. That's not a topic for today. You'll be glad to know. More exactly, the question is, could an LLM-driven chatbot augmented with robotic features like sensors and locomotion understand natural language? Thus leaving out of discussion notions like sentience, qualia, phenomenal consciousness, emotions, moods. I'll be haranguing you about that for the next half hour just to make sure we're clear, because sentience and consciousness have a funny way of creeping back into these discussions. So I'm going to keep that door shut, locked. And also, this is not a Chinese room question. That is, assuming the traditional definition of a computer, that is a machine that manipulates representation systematically according to rules. Searle's famous thought experiment, if coherent, I don't actually think it's coherent, but let's suppose it is coherent, would have shown computing in this sense to be insufficient for understanding. And I'm going to follow what's known as the robot reply to the Chinese room example. That a computer able to use language competently and make word-to-world connections by virtue of its robotic features can secure the semantic competence needed for language understanding. And we can imagine the robot's architecture to be driven, at least in part, by LLM technology. That'll be part of the discussion. Everybody with me so far? Questions?
Okay.
Good. A little bit of philosophy of language now. Many of you know this, but for those of you who don't, Austin famously distinguished between phatic, locutionary, and illocutionary acts. Sorry about the terminology, but we'll try to explain it. A phatic act is one in which a speaker makes an utterance in a way that's sensitive to the part or parts of speech contained in a grammatical structure, if any, of the expression used. That permits direct, when somebody, for example, I might report what somebody said in Swahili, and so long as I'm sensitive to the fact that it's a noun phrase, verb phrase utterance, I performed a phatic act. And somebody might report me by using the direct discourse, Mitch said, blah, blah, blah. That's a phatic act according to Austin. A locutionary act is one in which a speaker, blah, 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 with a grasp of the meaning of the clause used, makes an utterance. They've got to understand the language, and that permits direct discourse. They could say, Mitch said, blah, 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 without having to have quotation marks after the said. And then there's illocutionary acts, an act of the kind. I tend to define illocutionary acts in the more classical way. An act of the kind that can but need not be performed by saying and meaning, speaker meaning, that you're doing so. So that permits direct quotation, indirect, such as locutionary, and commissive discourse, such as Mitch claimed that P, where P stands for proposition. That's reporting an assertion on my part. A proper, beefy, full-blooded speech act. Yeah. Our question is here is whether machines can, like humanoid robots that contain LLMs, sensors, etc., can perform locutionary acts. I'll point in the direction, I'll make some gestures in the direction of the question about illocutionary acts later on, but I won't go too far into it because there's enough work to be done here. And my feeling is that having been reading top papers and books in the philosophy of artificial intelligence in the last couple of years, I feel like a lot of people need to slow down and take it easy and make some distinctions and make use of the stuff that's already pretty well established in the philosophies of language and mind. And I think that'll probably help diffuse a lot of confusion and maybe even settle some debates. So, in an article that I've got forthcoming in Philosophy of Artificial Intelligence, I did argue that machines can perform locutionary acts. And as referenced earlier, an article that Jan Michael, who's here with us today, argued that under certain specific conditions, machines can perform illocutionary acts. I'm not going to repeat that stuff. Some epistemology. I've done some philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, now some epistemology, knowledge and understanding. In contrast to knowledge, I take understanding to come in degrees. And some of you will be happy to know that if you haven't studied much epistemology yet, for most of the last century, up until maybe 20 years ago, if somebody asked a professor, what's epistemology? They would have said, oh, it's a study of knowledge. Now, fortunately, people will say it's study of knowledge and understanding, and maybe they'll add wisdom to that as well. What's the difference? Well, knowledge, understanding, unlike knowledge, comes in degrees. So we might say things like, Alina understands the Krebs cycle better than I do. I kind of sort of remember the Krebs cycle from middle school biology, but it's kind of shaky. Alina, who's a research scientist, she knows her Krebs cycle backwards. Okay. But there may be a minimum threshold to count as understanding at all. If you ask me what the Krebs cycle is, and I start talking about bicycle mechanics or something, not even a little bit. Okay, but understanding still comes in degrees, even if it has to meet a bit of a threshold. Contrast to knowledge, I take understanding to be holistic. Theories, etc., are the sorts of things we understand. What happens and we understand persons insofar as they have some complexity. So if I understand George's need for validation, I'm going to make sense of why it is he behaves this way in certain contexts and that other way in other contexts, why he responds to my questions in certain ways. It's going to be putting together a wide variety of different behaviors in George. That's what, for example, a good therapist knows how to do. So the idea is that understanding involves taking different parts and showing how they relate to each other. Understanding admits both factive and non-factive uses, I think. So we'll say Aaron understands evolutionary theory, but notice we also say things like this. Aaron's understanding of evolutionary theory is panglossian, which Stephen Jay Gould would have meant to express the idea that he thinks that anything that's a result of natural selection is ideal. But that's not true. There are lots of things that are results of natural selection that are, so. Consider my nose. In springtime, when hay fever starts up, it's not ideal by any means, right? So it's not Panglossian. But so Aaron's going to have some mistakes in his understanding. Understanding is not effective, unlike knowledge. But again, I think it's probably a minimum threshold. Aaron's understanding can't be a total bust. He can't start talking about astrology if you ask him about evolutionary theory. Again, like a case we had before. Anyway, I'm going to focus on the factor use of understanding, nevertheless. All right. And understanding, how does it relate to experience? There are many cases of understanding that come with sort of an aha. So when you're trying to do a math problem and you stew over it and you take a nap and you wake up and you have some espresso and you sit down and say, oh, I get it. I need to use that axiom. Okay, fine. That's an aha experience. It's an experiential state. It's one of those type 4 things. Many cases of understanding involve that. That's cool. And that's probably the core notion or sort of culturally paradigmatic notion of understanding that we often get at by means of intonation or table thumping, or the word truly involves reference to an idea of an experiential state, that aha. But the core notion is not required for a literal application of the term understanding. That is, you can understand things without having an experience of understanding. It's really important for me. For example, sociolinguists have studied phenomena about conversational turn taking. Did you know that when you have a conversation face to face in real time with a person, you generally start talking about a half second before they're done with their sentence? You could have gone your whole life without knowing that, but now you know it. Now you're conscious of it. But if you've not heard it before, up until 30 seconds ago, you understood how to have real time face to face conversations perfectly well with no conscious experience of having done so. Likewise with personal space, how far we are next to each other. I was just reminded by that in a very tight elevator this morning. Self underrating. Students very often think that they don't know how to solve a problem or do a certain kind of task, but they do. They don't think they understand, so they don't have an experience of understanding. They do understand. Teachers will often report that. So understanding does not require a conscious experience of understanding. You can get it perfectly well without that manifesting itself in consciousness. Someone can literally understand conversational turn taking without ever having an aha or other conscious realization of how to do it. So, moral understanding does not require an experience of oneself grasping or realizing or comprehending it. How does this apply to language understanding? The situation is largely similar. So I follow a general picture of meaning as use, but that dictum needs a lot of work. There are aspects of how we use words that aren't particularly relevant to what they mean. Understanding language, I think, following that dictum is knowing how to use it. And that consists of a lot of things. You need to competently negotiate word rule connections. If somebody asks you what an orange is, you need to be able to, generally speaking, find an orange and bring one back or maybe describe it. And in a way that respecting syntactic recursion and semantic compositionality, we heard about that earlier today, those things earlier today. You need to be sensitive to truth conditions and inferential relations. If you know John saw Mary, you have to know that or be able to infer that Mary was seen by John, etc. Okay. But this does not require achieving adult human abilities to appreciate things like metaphor, irony, allusion, or implicature. That is to say, grasping speaker meaning is one thing. Try it again. Grasping linguistic meaning is one thing. Grasping speaker meaning um, grasping speaker meaning is not the issue. Okay, there are lots of ways in which adult competent language users do subtle things. We don't have to load the machines we're speculating about with those abilities before we count them as language understanders. They might, but I kind of doubt it. So again, nothing changes the earlier picture that understanding language doesn't require an experience of oneself grasping or realizing or comprehending anything. And it may, given what we know about understanding now, may come in degrees. That'll be important in a moment when I talk about certain kinds of language that might require some kind of experiential stuff. All right, so how are we going to get, how does this relate to things like chatbots and such? Alex Barber, let's go back to thinking about the nature of understanding. Alex Barber has a nice survey in which it's called Understanding as Knowledge of Meaning. He writes, semantic theories earn their keep as contributions not to conceptual analysis of our ordinary concepts of meaning or understanding, but to an explanatory project. The phenomenon being explained will be essential ingredient, the semantic ingredient of linguistic understanding. The nature of the explanation is cognitive and representational. Some really important terminologies got there. Our understanding of utterances consists in knowledge of their meaning. Understanding requires something going on cognitively, knowledge of their meaning. The semantic component of this understanding is achieved through cognitive processes that generate the uttered sentences truth conditions from internal representations, tacit knowledge, tacit that is not necessarily conscious, of the referential properties of component expressions and grammar in a way that's reflected abstractly in derivations within linguistic theory. This is more talking about classical Chomskyan style linguistics, but many of these points carry over. The idea is that if you want to ascribe linguistic understanding to a system of any kind, you have to give it something like internal representation that enable it to process the language in such a way as to that account for its ability to use language competently. Got to have internal representations. And this is just functionalism as applied to natural language understanding. But because they're tacit, they don't have to manifest themselves in conscious awareness. And then take the mainstream of cognitive science as it applies to language to say the following. When you grasp the meaning of an utterance, you do so automatically and generally unconscious. There are exceptions. We'll see some in a moment. Generally speaking, it just happens. And you're not aware of how it happens. So on the default view of language understanding, an agent may understand much language without experiential or affective states. In some areas of language, like terms for colors, tastes, sounds, or feelings, may be exceptions. We'll get to those. But no reason that a philosophical zombie must be able to understand large swaths of language. Philosophical zombie, terminology, sorry, that is something imagined by certain philosophers who will go unnamed here, who imagine somebody who behaves intelligently, gets around the world competently, but some people will say all is dark within. I think that's misleading. What you should say is has no phenomenal consciousness, because that leaves open the question they might have cognitive, conative states, etc. So I'm going to define a philosophical zombie as an individual who acts just like one of the rest of us, but they've got no phenomenal consciousness. They've got no what it's likeness, to use the old terminology. And this is not so speculative in some ways because less whimsically, there are well attested cases of blind sight. Has anybody heard of blind sight?
Yeah.
Blindsight is a case some of you have in which a subject has a lesion to the visual cortex and they go into an experimental situation and the neuroscientist says, okay, I know you think you don't see anything, but I've got a thing in front of you that's got four quadrants. And just if you had to say, where do you think the X is? And they say, oh, bottom left or something, much better than chance. So that is to say, they seem to have some visual acuity, but they don't have an experience of seeing anything. We can easily imagine what would be the analog of deaf audition. It would be you're able to have auditory acuity, but you don't have an experience of yourself hearing anything, and so on for other sensory modalities. Here's a hypothesis. If we could build machines that have cognitive and conative states, they might be zombies in the sense of not having anything experiential, but nevertheless by virtue of their sensors, detectors, and so forth, be able to make their way competently around the world and do something like perceive it. They just need to possess cognitive and representational states and inferential capacities and appropriate sensitivity to their external environment, and sensors will do for the latter. It's the same point applies to humanoid robots who are driven by LLMs. All right, so here's a conversation. There's a recent article by Jones and Bergen. Does Chat GPT-4 pass the Turing test? The answer is, doesn't do much better than 50%. But here's some dialogues that they reported. The green is the human user who's supposed to guess whether the thing behind the wall is a human or a robot. Here's when somebody says, okay, so what you been doing this morning? It says, it's still morning. So what have you been doing this morning? It's still morning and I just ate breakfast. What did you eat? Electrons? Trying to trip them up. Bread and something you probably don't know about. I see. Yes, I'm probably not really familiar with internet packets you computers are eating. It's just because the plants is made from is very rare in freezing climates like Europe. So the human said, got pretty high confidence, and I think it's a human. And there were some typos, et cetera, et cetera. So you can go through some of the other things in that slide or look at that article. It's not hard to find and see some examples of someone interacting with the chat. But that's not terrible. It's not useless. But somebody might have an objection. LLMs merely predict text. I see that objection a lot in the page. That's all they do is they predict what's going to happen next in the line of text. But even if there's a level of description in which this is true, that's compatible with another higher level description being part of the or at least a best explanation of what they do. After all, brains are just huge collections of neurons and synaptic connections among them. Well, yeah, but most of us are still happy with describing mentality to fellow human beings and sometimes even ourselves on at least our good days. Right? So let's not have a double standard. And I'm going to use inference as the best explanation as an important part of my methodology. Inference as the best explanation says when you've got a number of theories that are vying to explain a certain phenomenon, choose the best one. That's you're justified in choosing the best one. The best consists in simplicity, explanatory power, coherence with other things we know, and then we can debate about other theoretical virtues. But I'm taking it as well established that it's a better explanation of human behavior to use, well, folk psychology or scientific psychology, something at a higher level than just neurons and their synaptic connections to explain why it is that someone across the street as the bus was coming. Okay. And if we're willing to do that for our own species, should we be unwilling to do it for artifacts? So to put the point nicely, Millet and Buckner in the article I mentioned before, we talk about what they call the redescription fallacy. They say it arises when critics argue that a system cannot model a particular cognitive capacity simply because its operations can be explained in less abstract and more deflationary terms. In the present context, the fallacy manifests itself in claims that LLMs cannot possibly be good models of some cognitive capacity phi because their operations merely consist in a collection of statistical calculations or linear algebra operations or next token predictions. Such arguments are only valid if accompanied by evidence demonstrating that a system defined in these terms is inherently incapable of implementing phi, where that's some higher level cognitive capacity. To illustrate, consider the flawed logic in asserting that a piano cannot possibly produce harmony because it can be described as a collection of hammers striking strings, or that brain activity could not possibly implement cognition because it can be described as a collection of neural firings. The critical question is not whether the operations of an LLM can be simplistically described in non-mental terms, but whether these operations, when appropriately organized, can implement the same processes or algorithms as the mind when described in an appropriate level of computational abstraction. And I would say, right, good. I just want to make sure the caveat is that higher level description has to be licensed by inference to the best explanation. just because it's consistent with what we can explain is not enough to merit its posit. We need to sort of have it do some explanatory work. So to give a little bit more about the sort of it's an overstatement to describe this as a description of the architecture of LLMs, but something like the spirit behind some of what they have to say for themselves. There's inspired by the distributional model of meaning, according to which we can represent the meaning of a word through the context in which it's been observed in a corpus. And the distributional models predict similarity in meaning based on similarity of observed context, based on the so-called distributional hypothesis, which says if two words tend to occur in similar contexts, we can assume that they're similar in meaning. Now, as a general claim about what's involved in grasping linguistic meaning, that's not going to be very helpful. After all, we can know that two sentences, one of Turkish and one of Romanian, are intertranslatable. We might still have no idea what either of them means, but it might still be a start as long as it's connected with other kinds of competence. And the distributional hypothesis might be useful for some aspects of language. And a little bit more about sort of what the guts of an LLM are. These previous authors that I quoted at length do refer to it. Seems to me vectorial representations are key here. That is to say, when engineers build an LLM, what they do is build vectors that have n dimensions of complexity based on a huge amount of training data. That is essentially the number of dimensions are going to be the number of words that's going to be associated with the word in question, and sometimes very high end. And that's equivalent, of course, to a point in n-dimensional space. Two words are treated as similar, meaning if they're close to one another in that space, they're disparate if they're far apart. Mathematical operations like addition, subtraction, multiplication can be performed on these vectors. That's linear algebra for you, and thus on representations of meanings. For example, by subtracting the vector for man from the vector for king and adding the vector for woman, we can get a vector that's pretty close to the vector for queen. That's not nothing. So there's some machinery going on, machinery we can ascribe to these LLMs, and the idea is that these vectors can be seen as pretty good candidates for internal representation. So precisely the sort that Barber called for in what you would need to refer to an account of linguistic meaning, of an entity's grasping meaning. But you might say, what about concepts? To which I'll say, I'll give you concepts, most of them. This depends on the concept in question. For those explicable and inferential terms, I think there's no problem for a machine having a concept. So you've seen to the very essence of Tuesday if you know it comes after Monday and before Wednesday. Nothing else to know. Bachelor, heterozygote, and other areas of language are describable in inferentialist terms. Other concepts require some experience for a full grasp. So concepts like pecorino or dappled or hygge or anxious, there's a way in which I'm going to not have a full understanding of what all those words mean if I, for example, have never experienced anxiety or never tasted pecorino. I've got some grasp of those things. I know some things that we can infer from the occurrence of those words in a context, and likewise the corresponding context, but I still might be a bit impoverished relative to someone who's, as it were, seen them close up. But again, remember the Krebs cycle case. That doesn't mean I don't understand. That means my understanding is not as good as somebody else's. By embodiment, we here mean at least an ability reliably to recognize things of the kind in question by means of their sensory qualities. And it seems to me clear that a humanoid robot can do a lot of that kind of work. Their understanding of the concept pecorino might be less rich than ours, but that doesn't refute the claim that such machines can understand natural language. Remember Alina on the Krebs cycle. And again, I mean, a robot can grab you some pecorino from the shelf by its olfactory character or its visual or its label or something. But it's fine if you want to say, but they don't have a full understanding of those concepts. I'd be happy to grant that. That doesn't mean they have no understanding at all. And of course, they've got I think, a full understanding of many other things. And I also want to grant that language understanding sometimes has a phenomenology. Andre, don't give this away. Is that sentence grammatical? Somebody doesn't think so. You're missing a word, right?
Yeah, where's the
Rowed the
word?
boat or something? Anybody else want to try? Please. I'm sorry. Correct. That's right. So on analogy with the strong carry the boat. Ah, some of you had an aha experience, phenomenological. Cool. How about this case? The horse raced past the barn and fell. Grammatical or not? What do you think?
There's another word missing.
I'm sorry.
There's
So you
another
think it's
word.
ungrammatical unless you add a word.
Yeah.
Okay. Compare that sentence with this one. The balloon thrown over the wall splattered. Once you see that this is clearly meaningful, you can see that is meaningful too. That's grammatical too, right? Because this was the balloon that was thrown over the wall. The horse that was raced past the barn fell. Aha. In fact, somebody's phone was so happy to hear that it actually had an aha experience. Right. Okay, so I'm perfectly happy to grant that there are situations in which we have an aha experience when it comes to understanding language, but they're relatively atypical. And there's a bad argument from Galen Strawson that I came across recently. Imagine for the idea that there's always a phenomenology when it comes to understanding language. He says, consider a monolingual French speaker and a monolingual English speaker who both hear on their TV news the following sentence, which can be translated to English or French, that says, it will rain tomorrow. They have different experiences, which I'd say they might, but those differences of experience might not be constitutive of their understanding of the language. It might be that one hears a siren outside or one's dog is barking or something. So don't bother with that argument from Galen Strawson. Instead, and following the dominant adaptive unconscious view in cognitive science, understanding utterances in your home language is generally automatic and unconscious. When you're driving on the highway and you see a billboard, if it's in a language that you're competent in, you just understand it whether you want to or not. There's not a conscious process. Whereas if you're learning a new language, that process of understanding sentences is effortful and conscious, and you're exhausted after three of them. And there's no reason machines should be otherwise. That is to say, their language understanding, if they've got it, doesn't have to manifest itself in the conscious experience either. Somebody might say, and I'm getting coming towards the end, I think. Somebody might say, okay, Mitch, you've convinced us, sort of, kind of, maybe that machines with the appropriate word-world connections and inferential capacities and vectorial representations are all satisfied. They can have language understanding, but they're still not performing speech acts. Isn't that what we want them to do? Isn't what you're doing here small potatoes? To which I'd say, I actually like small potatoes. I like small, careful steps as we build a better research paradigm. So I'm not too bothered by that, but still, we might feel that locutionary acts are a far cry from illocutionary. That is, assertions and questions and commands and promises. Something like illocutionary acts seem required for our verbal interactions with chatbots, et cetera, to be substantial. Is there any prospect of humanoid robots performing these? Well, we did argue, Jan and I did argue for affirmative action under certain qualified situations. But for now, let's introduce the notion that could serve as a model for a kind of proto-illocution. That is something that's, so to speak, between the locutionary and the illocutionary act. This is what I call verbal signaling. And I forgot to put these in a sort of series so that we could focus on them one on one. But in 1950, Peter Strawson published an article called On Referring, a very influential article in which he mentioned the idea of signal, which he said, when somebody uses a description such as the so-and-so, they're signaling, not asserting, he says, signaling that there's a unique entity to which their words refer. I don't think he or hardly anybody else took up that notion. Urmson mentioned it, but didn't do much with it. So there's a notion of signaling, which I want to call verbal signaling. And so I've been trying to develop it. First of all, let's try to clarify the notion of a signal. It's an active trait designed to convey information. And that can happen in a brightly colored tree frog. Its bright coloration might signal its toxicity. My unintentional scowl might signal my irritation. I might even do it while talking on the phone. Probably not intentional, but it still might be a signal of my irritation. And so signaling is something that does not require intentions, although it could be done intentionally. Conveying information is a matter of making it available to an appropriate audience. So when I talk about conveying information, I'm being intentionally kind of vague. That's going to take different forms in different contexts, different niches, as it were. So what counts as conveying information will vary from one niche to another. What counts as conveying information to a fellow adult human being will differ from conveying information to a small child, for example. In both cases, I have to make it available to the recipient, whether or not they in fact understand it. So let's try to. I want to try to develop a notion of verbal signaling as a special type of signaling, and I'm going to use this as a way of talking about the semantic value of a sentence S, the double brackets. So here's a sufficient condition for what I'm going to call verbal signaling. One who tokens a sentence S with the objective of conveying the information encoded by S verbally signals S. By the way, you might say, why did I use objective? Because I think the notion of intention is fraught with consciousness. When we talk about intentions, we think about plans and visualize these grand schemes and so forth. It's not talk about intentions. As David Armstrong pointed out over 50 years ago, you could reconstruct a lot of the theory of speaker meaning by just talking about objectives rather than intentions. You're not going to lose anything of substantial value. So objectives, and notice that machines can have objectives even if they can't have intention. So I think talk of intentions in these contexts is probably distracting. Let's see if we can do without it. That's what I'm going to try to do at least. So I've got a notion of verbal signal. At least I've given a sufficient condition for the notion for a verbal signal. Note the absence of I already said that. Sorry. Claim humanoid robots verbally signal a lot of information. Verbal signaling is a candidate for a what I'd call cultural evolutionary precursor to assertion. That is not biological or genetic evolution, but cultural evolution. Cultural evolution is the kind of thing that explains how we started to use the eyed needle, which I'm currently kind of obsessed with. I just learned about the evolution, cultural evolution of the eyed needle. Imagine tailoring clothes for the first time. You can put all the skins that you want to on yourself. It's not going to keep you warm unless you have a way of tailoring your clothes to wrap them tightly around your legs and arms and so forth. So I'm into the eyed needle these days. But that's a result of cultural evolution. And I think that lots of speech act types of phenomena are as well. Verbal signaling might be precursor to our modern process, our modern phenomenon of assertion. And I've tried to develop this in a paper called Verbal Signaling, in an explosion of creativity of title choice in Oxford Studies in Philosophy of Language. And I've got a paper coming out in Intercultural Pragmatics in which I've tried to take that line of thought a little bit further. So let's think about some modern day humanoid robots. Here's a famous one, Sophia. And I think she's been sort of warehouse now. I don't think she's making the rounds anymore, but she did become a citizen of the country of Saudi Arabia for a while there. She was made by Hanson Robotics and went on talk shows. Tom Robbins interviewed her and so forth, and she didn't do terribly. Did great, didn't do terribly. I just think that there's a confusion here when they say um, uh, okay, in some ways, they're trying to put words into her mouth. In some ways, I'm a human crafted science fiction character depicting where AI and robotics are heading. In other ways, I'm real science, springing from the serious engineering and science research and accomplishments of an inspired team of robotics and AI scientists and designers. So far, so good. In their grand ambitions, my creators aspire to achieve true AI sentience. Darn, I wish I hadn't said that. That just muddies the waters. And I think it's a confusion thing for that, or at least it's not necessary to make a lot of really important contributions to artificial intelligence. Sentience is just something else, it seems to me. Likewise, Una recently debuted. I don't know if they've put this one to work. I won't read this entire thing, but here's another humanoid robot, and the company that made her UB Tech Robotics, I think, says that this could be a really good thing in, for example, service industry types of roles. Could be your the next thing you can encounter when you check into a hotel. You might get a humanoid robot that tells you where your room is and how much you have to pay. And if you want extra towels or hangers, you talk to Una and she'll get them for you. That's not totally unrealistic to imagine Una doing that sort of work. For harder, more sophisticated problems, she would call the human manager. But maybe companies could save a lot of money for better or for worse by having humanoid robots do that. My prediction is that humanoid robots are going to be as big a factor of our lives in 5 or 10 years as chatbots have recently become. And so we need to think about what sort of cognitive and cognitive capacities they have. And my hypothesis is that they can, at the very least, understand language. I think I'm done. Here's summing up. So humanoid robots driven in part by LLM technology and equipped with sensors and locomotion, et cetera, enabling them to interact in real time with complex and dynamic environment, can understand natural language and thus perform and comprehend locutionary acts. This claim depends on the attribution to them of concepts, but again, no double standards, please, between ourselves and them. Their understanding might be inferior to that of neurotypical humans, particularly concerning their grasp of language, referring to experience demanding phenomena. But recall the Krebs cycle example, their notion of understanding. Certain of their utterances may also be verbal signals, as I've just defined, and thus precursors to modern day speech acts. I should also say, as verbal signals, unlike locutionary acts, you can see how you might want to criticize a chatbot or a humanoid robot for for creating a verbal signal that's misleading, for example, or just untrue. Lie, not necessarily. I'm not sure that applies, but it might be enough leverage to criticize the machine by saying you verbally signaled that so and so and you were wrong, or that was misleading, or that was confusing, or something. And here's a question: can these machines engage in anything like empathy? I would distinguish different types of empathy. There's affective empathy, understanding how somebody feels, as you can imagine how this is going to go. Cognitive empathy, understanding what somebody's aims are, and cognitive empathy. You might hope that a machine like this could engage in cognitive empathy of the sort that would enable it to understand what somebody's thoughts are, what somebody's cognitive state is. So, for example, in the US, where there are constant debates about the morality of abortion, to understand what somebody who's pro-life, that is anti-abortion, thinks, you have to understand that they truly believe that a fetus is completely a person, even at the point of conception. It took me years to figure that out, but to understand that, it's a matter of cognitive empathy, not anything else. So that's an achievement that I don't know that machines that were within anything like 10 or 20 years of building are going to be capable of having. That'd be an interesting thing to aspire to. But you can understand language without cognitive empathy. And I am done. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Mitch. I found it amazing.
Thanks.
It was really dense. I need to chew it
Sure.
up a bit,
Sure.
a lot of concepts, a lot of new things.
Sure.
But for those folk who maybe run faster than me, my processor is more slower than the others who have some questions in the room or in the online chat. Yeah, we have Leonard here if you want to come up here so he can see you as well.
Oh yeah.
Let
And
me.
should I do something with my screen? Like
Oh no no
maybe.
no no!
Okay.
It's all right here.
Okay.
You can talk on mine if you want.
Sure.
Let's sit down.
All right. Good. Hello.
Hi, nice to meet you. And thank you very much for the talk. So I think I agree on like all the object level claims. So I have more question about methodology. So you mentioned that you like take some inference to the best explanation approach to
Mhm.
these questions. And I want to
Yes.
have to know what that amounts to, because when I sort of imagine like inference to the best explanation, I would imagine something like, okay, we have these sort of language robots and all their behaviors, and then we consider the explanation that they can engage of all of these behaviors because they actually understand language, and then compare it with like other hypotheses and maybe look at like which different theoretical virtues these have and so on. And to me, it seemed that you're more doing something else, that you are like looking at sort of different theories of language understanding and then sort of argued for this account where language understanding is like tightly connected to language use, and then sort of like applying theories in this domain to the question and not so much doing like, I don't know, inductive, like fallible inference to the explanation style reasoning.
I don't know if I fully understand the question, Leonard. I mean, I do think that language understanding is tightly bound up with competent language use.
Yeah.
That's, one. So if you've got an entity that seems to be using language competently, then the question is what explains that
Yeah.
competence? And I'm taking it that one theory that would explain it would be, oh, it's got internal representations of the sort that Alex Barber said you have to posit to account for language understanding. And so the idea is then what are those internal representations about this? Not very plausible when it's applied to chatbots, just because of their architecture. But vectors strike me as a better candidate, for example. And so, if we're gonna put our functionalist money where our mouths are, we need to leave open the possibility of multiple realizability. And whereas understanding might be realized in one way in our species, it might be realized in a different way, yet still with internal representations in other types of things. Now, so I guess when I talk about inference, the best explanation, I'm giving a very short version of it here because of constraints, but I'm saying here's a good explanation of why the chatbots do what, how the chatbots are able to do what they do, internal representations that vouchsafe, that underlie the language competence. Now, of course, anybody's welcome and encouraged to come to the table and say, no, I've got a more parsimonious explanation that is
Yeah.
otherwise intelligible, otherwise coherent, otherwise consistent with what we know. And if they do that, that in a way that doesn't involve any internal representations, I say, okay, so much the worse of my theory.
Mhm. Okay,
Right.
thank you.
So I'm this is empirical in that sense. It's not armchair. But again, the same applies for somebody who thinks they can understand human language understanding without appeal to concepts. And I
Mhm.
would say, hey, if
Okay.
you can do that, then that's a lovely parsimonious theory. It might be a sort of a limitativist in the way that maybe the Churchlands would have approved, but
Mhm.
that's might be how science goes.
Mhm.
So this is not an attempt to say we can know a priori that chatbots have mentality, but rather, given their behavior, their competence, their impressive achievements, we've got some grounds for inferring something about the internal representations that underlie their competence. Does that help? Does that address your question? I'm not entirely sure that it does.
Yeah, that answers the question. Then the answer is that
Okay,
your account of like language understanding is more like cognitivist and less behaviorist than I picked up from you.
correct.
Thank you.
Exactly. Cognitivist in the sense that I think is consistent with functionalism.
Yeah.
Because functionalism departs from cognitivism by saying we're going to posit internal states that mediate input and output. So
Yeah.
in that respect, it's not terribly novel. It's just using off-the-shelf functionalism, as it were.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Yeah, we also have one from the room from Alex, or if he tries first, and then it's your. Okay. Okay.
I know you. Good to see you again.
So even if you assume more functionalism and basically say that language understanding should be multiply realizable.
Yeah.
And also cognitive states should be multiply realizable. Uh, you I think that you also have to face the objection that, for example, ChatGPT, you tell it to generate for you an image of a glass of wine that is full.
A glass of wine that's full.
Yeah, and because all the data that he has been fed as glasses of wine that are half full, because that's how they wine, it overfeeds and gives you some abomination, not a full glass of wine.
You said this gives you an abomination, something
Yeah,
that's bad, a bad picture.
Yeah,
Is that
bad
good?
picture.
Yeah, sure, sure.
So here is a case
Mhm.
where semantically it seems to kind of get it, but it doesn't. So you have these differences at the same level of explanation. Yeah. In language competence. Right. So if you then say that he understands language, but in his own way, because the function is that he performed is basically different from the one that humans do, because humans do not overfit like that with that amount of data, because they also have the poverty of stimulus and stuff like that. I know, seems kind of that type of understanding isn't as interesting as saying that an LLM understands like us the language.
I see. I think I understand your point. I mean, it seems to me it's consistent with saying that an entity of any kind understands language. That's a very broad claim to allow that there are lots of particular local areas where it doesn't do that well. I don't do that well with the Krebs cycle, right? Lots of things that I'm not very good at. I'm not very good with color coordination. I'm often criticized for my bad choice of color coordination. So just because there's a failing, I'm not sure how much that shows.
It's not language understanding, sorry. It's like area of knowledge or like color mixing or curve cycle. This is not you not understanding language.
Um, I'm enough of a holist about meaning to say that when I, think about, for me to have a full understanding of the notion of a mitochondrion or the word mitochondrion, I need to know how it functions in a cell. And if I don't have a good grasp of the Krebs cycle, I know I can. If someone says the word mitochondrion or Golgi body, I kind of have a vague, but I'd have a better understanding of those concepts if I knew what the Krebs cycle was. So I'm following philosophers like Quine, who would say language and meaning are holistic things. They often go together. It's very rare when you can just say Schiller means unmarried male and you're done. That's a very unusual case. We shouldn't take that as paradigmatic. So I want to be relatively, I think I guess I'd say the mainstream of philosophers of language would say that most areas of natural language are holistic in their meaning in this respect. So I want to push back a little bit about what you're saying
sorry
there.
for
No problem, no problem. But I'm going to take the point, but I still want to be holistic. Uh, so part of my answer to the question, to your question before was, of course, we should expect some deficiencies. Well, we all have deficiencies in certain areas of understanding. If there's a characteristic or systematic deficiency, that's more of a problem. Jan might say, well, let's hook it up with DAL-E, whatever it's called, to have it, make it use AI to generate an image. It might do better. So I'm not quite sure what to say about the case of the half-filled glass of wine. It might be just that we say to the engineers, you have to do better when it comes to visual imagery, especially in certain areas, and they go back to their Google headquarters for a few weeks and they come up with something better. So the particularities of ways in which a machine like this might fail are not going to bother me so much as long as they're not systematic. If they're systematic, that's more of an issue.
Can you tell me your name, please? Laura, yeah. So Laura and then Dragomir. Please go, Laura. No, it was Laura after Alex. Yeah.
So thank you so much for the talk. It's super interesting.
Thanks.
So I do have a question that maybe seems a little bit trivial, but I think is actually into something like
Good.
more, let's say. And it is on how you would imagine the relationship between the LLM and the sensors.
In the sense of
So if you would say that you need like another system that keeps them all together, or if you would say that for having this type of language understanding, the sensor should like modify the LLM. So because in parts of your speech, I was thinking that maybe then the argument is that the robots have the understanding, powered both by the sensor and the LLM. But then if you do not rely so much on the LLM and the like distribution of semantic vectors and so on, you might then kind of lose something from that part of the argumentation.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about how you would imagine that kind of machine.
Right.
And
what's the relative role of those two parts? I think it's part of what you're getting at.
yeah,
And I would say,
if you need something.
yeah, right. It's clear to me that you would need something else to put them all together. I'm certainly no engineer that would know how to do that. There might be people in the room who would have ideas about that, but I don't. But I'm assuming that engineers could build a sort of coordinating system so that a word that occurs in the vector space is associated with certain types of visual displays so that the machine can say, okay, Apple, it's got now a sort of template that its visual sensors need to be able to match it to, or something like that. I'm just making this up really, but I'm just trying to be intuitive. And the idea is that I'd want to say that if you could coordinate those two things, then you want to ascribe mentality, at least cognitive and cognitive states, to the entire robot, not to any component of it. Just as I've got beliefs, doesn't follow that any sub part of me has beliefs. That's my general view. But again, I want to be clear that I don't have any expertise in the engineering of robots, and so that's something that we'd have to talk to Hanson Robotics over in Singapore to figure out how they get their machines to work. But that's a fair question.
Yeah, please go. Oh, yeah.
Okay. I was thinking of people with congenital analgesia. They are born without the possibility of feeling pain.
Of feeling pain, yeah.
I think that they can understand partly the concept of pain because they can talk about pain. They can say, well, I wish I knew how pain felt, and so on.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it seems that, well, a large, I don't know how many die pretty young. So although they have an understanding of pain, maybe they miss one very important part of understanding what pain means, given that, well, they suffer a lot.
There's a question for you to make sure I understand. Does their dying young, is that attributable to their analgesia? That is to say, I've heard of cases in which, sailors who've lost feeling in their feet or end up on a boat and they burn their skin because they don't even feel any pain for whatever reason. Of course, that's a health hazard, right? So likewise, if I didn't feel pain, I'd be much more likely to do serious damage to my body. Is that why people die young when they have this condition? You do know?
I think so. Okay. What I want to say is maybe, well, they partly understand the concept of pain, but not the essential, very important part of the idea of pain. Now, if this is the case, maybe a large language model not having subjective experiences misses part of what is so very important about pain, and as such, maybe will not be able to understand some part of our moral language.
about moral
moral
language.
and
Yeah.
propositions like pain is a disvalue.
Yeah.
Disvalue in itself,
Yeah.
or parts of or moral verdicts based on utilitarian principles.
Mhm.
Don't do that because it promotes it increases overall pain.
More suffering.
Like or suffering.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I agree that an LLM could have a partial understanding of pain, but maybe it misses some very important part of what pain is.
Yeah.
Which is there to do how does it feel?
Yeah, right. Pain hurts.
Yeah, pain is
Like love.
you know.
So right, I think it's an open question just how important the hurtingness of pain is to understanding the concept of pain. I don't know how to answer that question. I mean, if I were programming the humanoid robot to deal effectively with human beings, I would say, here's what you need to know about pain. To be avoided. Look for sites of damage, etc. Don't inflict it on others, unless it's absolutely necessary. Imagine this robotic dentist who's got to cause pain in patients. You can still minimize it, right? Right. So sometimes pain's a necessary evil, etc. Is that enough? I don't know.
Yes, it's necessary, but someone who doesn't know how pain feels might consider necessary certain situations or circumstances that would not be considered.
That's right.
Someone
We've
that
got to
actually knows how pain feels.
we've got to really be very careful
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
giving power. So again, I don't know how to answer that question. My thought has been that, at least for sensory terms, read, dappled, etc., the actual phenomenological character of the sensations, experiences that we have associated with those terms is important, but still, if you lack it, you still understand. And the thought is just, there are lots of types of experiences that I've never had, but I've been given a good enough description of them. So I've got some idea what's going on, right? So I've never experienced, clinical depression, thank goodness. But I know people who have. I read about people who have. Do I have? Am I basically, am I ignorant in a really important way about clinical depression? I don't know the answer to that question, but at least I'd like to think that somebody who's suffering from that kind of depression, I would at least know how to interact with them in a at least way that wouldn't do them more harm than good, right? I'm not sure I'd want to be their physician even if I had that skill, but I don't think so. I guess the thought is, for purposes of sort of making sure machines don't do any more harm than necessary, make sure that they're very hands-offish or something like that when it comes to these sort of hot button sort of concepts, pain, love, terror, depression, things like that. For now, until we get a better handle on just what's the most important aspect of these things. But I'm happy to, let me put it this way. I'm happy to concede that there are going to be certain terms and associated concepts on which the machine is going to be below us in its understanding of what those terms mean or the concepts. And then the question is, so far beyond us or below us that they're kind of hopeless. I just think that requires more investigation.
Okay, so we'll take two other questions because we're running short of time. So
Sure.
please go, and then we have Chris Cousins online.
Great.
So yeah, thanks a lot, Mitch. So I agree with almost everything you said. So I'm going to try and argue, be a bit provocative, and maybe
Sure.
argue for a version of the small potatoes response, or at least in the context of the dialectic that set up.
Yeah.
So I think part of why I can get on board with your position is you issue all the appropriate caveats, right? You say, understanding, but maybe only partial understanding, maybe understanding the falters, maybe only a subset of concepts or words, not all of them.
Yeah.
Maybe a lot of it's going to require embodiment. So we're talking about like hypothetical future systems,
That's right.
Just existing current systems.
Right.
But then, of course, so you began the talk with some quotes from people like Bender and Collar, like Latham Murphy, and so on. And Bender and Collar are kind of like the most extreme end of the spectrum. But even they were focused on text-bound LLMs that existed in 2021.
Right.
They talk about like particular systems and text-bound systems in particular. They are still a bit strong because they seem to think there's no understanding whatsoever there. But someone like Lake and Murphy are a bit more careful. They talk about text-bound models, but also vision language models. And they kind of say understanding has these various aspects. And, here's some respects of which language models and even vision language models still falter in certain ways, but they're not philosophers, so they kind of go a bit back and forth, and sometimes they say they don't understand, sometimes they say they don't have human understanding,
Yeah, right.
human-like
Right.
understanding. Maybe we can forgive them that. So I maybe the question is, do you think this would be a really controversial view once you've laid out all the caveats?
Oh, I hope not.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. I hope that, I mean, a lot of what I do when I do philosophy is a lot of throat clearing. And after the throat has been cleared, it often turns out that in some ways the difficulty, the perplexity tends to, kind of dissipate, not vanish, but dissipate. So I still am making a substantial claim. It's not as if it's a priori obvious or anything, but as we saw in our conversation with Leonard, for example, that I'm still making an empirical claim that could turn out to just be untrue. So I think it's plausible, but I don't want anybody to leave the room saying it's, what Mitch said was obvious, because it's not obvious. It's a question that needs to be answered by close empirical investigation. But I'm hoping that some of the prima facie, what seemed like decisive objections to the whole project have been cleared away, partly just by some clarification. Don't confuse consciousness and sentience and phenomenal consciousness with some of the other aspects of mentality. I think a lot of philosophical action happens right there. So in this respect, it's kind of like, some philosophy is more therapeutic than it is an actual positive claim. But there is also some positive claims here that are really ultimately empirical claims that account. So does that help clarify what the sort of methodology is? I guess I want you to agree, but I want you to realize that this is a claim that could turn out to be just untrue. Somebody could publish a paper or perform an investigation 2 years from now that said, no, I've got an explanation of how these things work that is both simpler than Green's and does not posit internal representations, to which I'd have to say, game over.
And our last question from is from Professor Chris Cohens from Glasgow. Please go ahead.
Hi, Chris.
Mitch, thanks very much. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much. Good to see you.
My question is, I still, well, bad phrasing. I still find the embodiment slightly weird, and here's a question that might illustrate where my lack of understanding comes in. Let's say you put an AI program or an LLM into a robot with all the appropriate sensory data. It wanders around understanding, having representational states, and then you unplug
At least
it.
according to me.
You then unplug it. It loses all of the engagement with the world. What happens to is it now no longer able to understand or represent, and it's sort of
You said
regresses?
you
Or is
were
there any kind
imagining
of
unplugging it?
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, does the unplugging erase all the programming?
I wouldn't no. So just disconnecting the LLM from the sensory apparatus and the
I
robot.
see. I see. No, I think it's going to lose a lot of language understanding. It'll still, I take it, be fine with things like bachelors or unmarried. That is to say, those concepts that can be defined in a way that makes inferentialists happy, classical inferentialists happy, I think it'll still have. But because that's a relatively specialized area of natural language, it's going to, I would be hesitant to say it understands natural language. I think that worldly connection stuff is really important. But of course, just the worldly connection stuff is not going to stand on its own either. You need to have some conceptual scaffolding on which that is built. So I think both of them really play a role. So again, if your question is, if you were to detach the chatbot from the robot, so to speak, what would you have left in the chatbot? I would say some, I think, primitive understanding that applies to those areas of natural language that can be defined in inferentialist terms, but that's not very much. And that might even be below the threshold of, like the person who explains natural selection in terms of astrology. It's like, no, they don't understand. I don't know the answer to that question. But for me, the model is give them the worldly connections because we take that as pretty crucial to understanding at least natural languages that we all know. Does that help? Thanks so much, Chris.
Thank you so much, Mitch, again, for the presentation. Let's have another round of applause. Thank you. So everybody here and online will have a really short, I mean really, really short 5-minute break, and then we'll be with our next speaker, Patrick Bartley from Global Priorities Institute, Oxford University. I'm sorry if I butchered your name. I mean famous for that. Notorious name criminal.